Let's jump right in. Today, we're doing something a bit different for this explainer. We're engaging in a massive historical thought experiment. Think of it as blending the deep, abstract world of theology with the cold, razor-sharp logic of a courtroom. Usually we look at history's prominent figures and we see moral guides, maybe philosophers. But today, we're treating them strictly as legal witnesses. We want to answer a really profound question. How do we actually weigh evidence of the unseen? We're going to examine a highly compelling argument that takes the foundational rules of evidence and applies them to answer exactly that. Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to step into the role of a jury for a moment. You're sitting right there in the jury box and you are evaluating the ultimate legal case, a case about the very nature of existence and what actually happens after we die. So ask yourself, what is the absolute strongest, most airtight evidence in a court of law? If you're trying to establish a fact completely beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt, you don't just want one person's word, right? One person can be mistaken. One person might have a hidden motive. To get to absolute certainty, you want corroboration. You need multiple, totally unrelated people pointing to the exact same set of facts, completely independent of one another. And that brings us to a really fundamental legal concept, the independent witness. This is when multiple individuals from totally different times, different cultures, different languages, who, without ever knowing each other, testify to the exact same fundamental truth. Think about the incredible power of this in a modern courtroom. The legal principle is incredibly clear here. The more independent sources that reach an identical conclusion without ever colluding, the exponentially lower the probability of it just being a mere coincidence. If two people who have literally never met, who don't even speak the same language, go to the police with the exact same highly specific story, you're going to believe them. But what if we scaled that up? What if it wasn't just two people? Well, consider this staggering number, 124,000. We aren't just talking about a handful of witnesses in this historical courtroom. The source material we're examining today points to an almost incomprehensible scale of primary witnesses. This number represents a continuous chain of testimony that spans countless centuries. Just imagine it, 124,000 different individuals. They lived across vastly different epochs, they spoke completely different languages, they navigated totally distinct cultural landscapes, and remember, they didn't have the internet, right? They couldn't coordinate their messages, they literally never met to get their story straight. Yet despite all of that, they all came forward with the exact same core testimony. And this brilliantly illustrates a concept that sits right at the core of an argument presented by the Islamic scholar Bediüzzaman Sayyad Nursi. In his renowned work, The Tenth Word, he frames these 124,000 prophets throughout history as humanity's most credible, distinguished, and reliable witnesses. He argues that they perfectly corroborate each other, testifying together to the existence of the afterlife. According to his text, some of them base this on direct spiritual vision, while others base it on absolute, undeniable conviction. But the verdict they deliver, it's entirely unanimous. So they aren't presented here just as spiritual leaders preaching to a flock. They're presented as the ultimate expert witnesses, submitting their formal testimony to the court of human history. So the crucial point Nursi makes here is that this massive, independent agreement mathematically defies randomness. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces fit perfectly without anyone looking at the box. In his framework, when you have this immense network of independent individuals across completely different eras, and they all converge on one single, unifying truth, the existence of an afterlife, the probability of this being a mere coincidence essentially drops to zero. Literally zero. In the context of this argument, if 124,000 entirely independent sources yield the exact same result without any possibility of tampering or collusion, it has to be treated as an undeniable fact. The whole structure of the text relies heavily on that sheer volume and the strict independence of these witnesses, basically positing that their collective testimony is logically impenetrable. Let's move forward and see how this builds, because the argument presented in our source doesn't actually stop with those primary witnesses. It introduces another astronomical number to our courtroom, 124 million. According to the text, these are the saints, the spiritual masters, and the scholars who came after the prophets. Think of them as secondary expert witnesses, or better yet, independent auditors. They didn't just blindly accept the primary testimony that was passed down to them. The text argues that through their own profound spiritual discoveries, their rigorous observations, and deep reflections, they independently verified the exact same truth. We can really weigh this evidence by contrasting the two groups. On one side, you have the foundational, primary testimony, the 124,000 prophets establishing the initial claim of the afterlife. And then, on the other side, you have the independent verification, the 124,000 million saints confirming it. It is a massive, unprecedented model of peer review and corroboration. The primary witnesses lay down the facts, and then this overwhelmingly vast body of subsequent, highly qualified investigators comes in and validates those facts. By contrasting the foundational testimony with this staggering subsequent corroboration, the text cements the overwhelming weight of the evidence completely beyond any reasonable doubt within this framework. Now, what's really interesting about this is how this massive scale of testimony is anchored in a specific ancient textual source. This verse from the Quran, specifically chapter 33, verse 7, speaks directly of a solemn pledge, a binding covenant taken from the prophets. In the context of our courtroom thought experiment today, you can look at this verse as the ultimate legal contract of history. It serves as a formal, almost cosmic documentation of their shared, unified testimony. It shows us that this isn't just some loose collection of random historical claims. No, it's a highly structured, unified agreement across time that was formally recorded. The source highlights the key signatories of this universal covenant: Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. By focusing on these monumental, cross-cultural figures mentioned in the text, we can really see the incredible diversity of this unbroken chain. I mean, these are history-shaping figures. They lived in vastly different epochs, they faced entirely different societal challenges, and they were speaking to entirely different civilizations. Yet, they are fundamentally united in their core message regarding the unseen. They are essentially the lead signatories on a metaphorical legal document, one that has been corroborated millions of times over by subsequent generations. Which brings us to the final question of this thought experiment. The framework from our source has been laid out before you, a vast volume of independent witnesses spanning thousands of years, formally bound by historic covenant and rigorously verified by millions more. The fundamental logic of the courtroom dictates that we must weigh this evidence. So, sitting there as the jury, how do you evaluate this chain of testimony? When you are faced with an argument based on a historical consensus of this magnitude, one that crosses every conceivable boundary of language, geography, and time to point to a single truth, what is your verdict? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will leave you to ponder that ultimate question.